Life of medieval peasants. Under feudalism, life for medieval peasants was defined by hardship, resilience, and a constant struggle for survival within the rigid framework of the feudal system. From the 9th century through the late Middle Ages, peasants made up the vast majority of the population in Europe, forming the backbone of agricultural labor and sustaining the nobility, clergy, and emerging towns. Yet despite their essential role, they lived in conditions that modern readers would consider almost unbearably harsh, working long hours in the fields, living in cramped and unsanitary dwellings, eating monotonous diets, and facing constant vulnerability to famine, disease, and exploitation. Still, they endured. Understanding how they lived under feudalism requires exploring their homes and villages, their obligations to lords and the church, the cycles of agricultural work, the patterns of community life, and the subtle strategies they developed to resist oppression and carve out moments of humanity. The feudal system provided the overarching framework of life for medieval peasants. At its core, feudalism was a system of obligations and dependencies that bound society into a rigid hierarchy. Kings granted lands to nobles, nobles granted smaller parcels to vassals, and at the very bottom of the pyramid were peasants, who worked the land in exchange for protection. Most peasants were serfs, meaning they were legally tied to the land they farmed. Unlike slaves, serfs could not be bought or sold individually, but they could not leave without the lord's permission, and their labor was considered part of the estate. A smaller portion of peasants were free tenants, renting land from a lord for money or services, though even they often lived under severe restrictions. In practice, this meant that the average peasant family worked not only to feed themselves, but also to provide a steady flow of food, labor, and taxes to sustain their lords and the church. Daily life revolved around the agricultural cycle. The peasant year was divided not by weeks or months, as much as by tasks associated with planting, tending, and harvesting. In spring, fields had to be plowed and sown with barley, oats, or wheat. Summer brought weeding, haymaking, and tending livestock. Autumn was dominated by the exhausting work of harvesting grain, storing it, and preparing for winter. Winter was comparatively slower, but never idle. Repairing tools, maintaining houses, and tending animals still required labor. The medieval agricultural system was labor-intensive, relying on simple tools like wooden plows, sickles, and scythes. Oxen were used for heavy plowing, though they were slow and expensive to maintain, and only wealthier villagers could afford horses fitted with harnesses suited for farming. Everything depended on the harvest, and a poor yield could mean hunger or famine. Still, peasants developed local knowledge of soils, weather, and farming techniques, which allowed them to endure year after year, despite the fragility of their existence. The typical peasant diet reflected both their dependence on the harvest and their limited resources. Bread was the staple, usually made from rye or barley rather than wheat, which was expensive and reserved for wealthier households. Porridge, pottage, a thick stew of grains and vegetables, and cheese formed the other main components of their meals. Meat was rare, except for special occasions, though peasants might eat pork from pigs that foraged in the woods, or small game caught in traps. Hunting larger game, however, was generally forbidden, as forests were controlled by lords. To supplement their diet, peasants gathered nuts, berries, and herbs from nearby woods and hedges. During periods of famine, they resorted to eating whatever could be foraged, including acorns and roots, though these could cause illness. Ale, brewed from barley, was the common drink, safer than water from streams or wells, which was often contaminated. While monotonous and lacking in nutrition, the peasant diet was usually sufficient in good years, but during bad harvests, malnutrition quickly weakened bodies and made entire communities susceptible to disease. Peasant housing was simple and crude, reflecting their poverty and the materials available. Most lived in small huts made of wattle and daub, with thatched roofs and earthen floors. Inside, there was usually one room, sometimes divided into separate spaces for humans and animals. The family shared the space with chickens, pigs, or goats, whose body heat helped keep the dwelling warm in winter. Smoke from the central hearth filled the room, as chimneys were rare, leaving walls blackened and lungs damaged over time. Furniture was minimal: wooden benches, straw-stuffed mattresses, and a simple table. Privacy was non-existent, with families, children, and animals all living under the same roof. Despite the cramped conditions, these homes provided the center of family life, a place to gather after exhausting days in the fields and to share what little food they had. Villages consisted of clusters of such houses, along with a church and the occasional mill or communal oven, and were often surrounded by fields divided into strips that were farmed by different families under the open field system. Religion shaped nearly every aspect of peasant life, offering both comfort and control. The local church was not only a spiritual center, but also a community hub. Peasants paid tithes, usually a tenth of their produce, to the church, which added to their already heavy burdens. Still, faith offered peasants a way to endure suffering, providing the promise of salvation in the afterlife and the reassurance that their hardships were part of a divine plan. The church calendar also structured their year, with numerous feast days offering rare respites from labor. On holy days, peasants gathered for celebrations, dances, and games, allowing moments of joy and social connection amid hardship. Superstition and folk practices coexisted with Christianity. Amulets, charms, and local healers remained important in daily life. Religion thus provided peasants with a framework for meaning, community, and hope, even as the church itself demanded obedience and resources. Obligations to lords were a constant reality. Peasants owed rents, often in both labor and kind. They might be required to spend several days each week working on the lord's domain, the land directly owned by the lord, plowing, harvesting, or repairing buildings. They also owed various dues, grain, eggs, or livestock handed over at specified times. Fees were required for nearly every life event, marriage, inheritance, or even the right to use the village mill or oven. Lords enforced these obligations strictly, backed by the manorial court, which settled disputes and punished offenders. Peasants thus lived under the watchful eye of their lord's officials, with little room for autonomy. Yet, the system was not entirely one-sided. Lords owed their peasants protection from bandits or rival lords, and during times of war, peasants could seek shelter within castles or fortified manors. Still, the imbalance of power left peasants vulnerable to exploitation, particularly in times of scarcity. Despite these constraints, peasants found ways to build community and resist oppression. Village life fostered solidarity. Neighbors worked together during harvests, shared tools, and supported each other in times of need. Informal customs, rather than written laws, often governed disputes, and local traditions gave peasants some sense of autonomy. Resistance to lordly demands sometimes took subtle forms, working slowly, hiding produce, or claiming illness to avoid extra labor. In more extreme cases, open revolts erupted, though these were risky and often brutally suppressed. Still, the collective life of the village allowed peasants to maintain a sense of identity, shared culture, and resilience against the constant pressures of feudal demands. Children in peasant families contributed to survival from a young age. By the time they could walk, children helped with small tasks such as carrying water, tending geese, or gathering firewood. By adolescence, they worked in the fields alongside adults. Education was rare, though some boys might learn basic literacy if they aspired to become clerks or join the church. Girls were often married young, their lives dominated by household labor and childbearing. High infant mortality meant families often had many children, though only some survived to adulthood. Despite these challenges, play and festivals gave children some joy, with simple games, toys made of wood or cloth, and participation in village celebrations. Women's roles were central but undervalued. Peasant women not only worked the fields alongside men, but also bore responsibility for domestic tasks, baking bread, brewing ale, spinning wool, tending gardens, and caring for children. Their labor was essential to survival, yet they were bound by both feudal obligations and patriarchal norms. Women had limited legal rights and were often subject to the authority of fathers or husbands. Still, within the household, women's contributions gave them significant influence, and in times of crisis, they were often the glue that held families and communities together. The resilience of peasants lay not only in their physical endurance, but in their ability to carve out meaning, joy, and community within harsh conditions. Festivals, marriages, and communal gatherings punctuated the cycle of labor, giving peasants moments of relief and celebration. Storytelling, songs, and dances preserved local culture and traditions. Even in the shadow of feudal oppression, peasants created lives that were rich in human connection, anchored by shared struggles and small victories. Their survival was not merely biological but cultural, maintaining a continuity of community that would carry Europe through centuries of hardship. Ultimately, the life of medieval peasants under feudalism was one of profound hardship, but also remarkable endurance. Their labor sustained the entire social order, yet they lived under constant pressures from lords, the church, and nature itself. They inhabited cramped homes, ate meager diets, and faced relentless obligations. Yet they endured, drawing strength from family, faith, and community. Their resilience laid the foundation for Europe's slow transformation, for without the peasants, no harvests would have been reaped, no armies fed, no castles maintained. While their lives were often invisible in the grand chronicles of kings and battles, the story of medieval peasants is the story of survival itself. Ordinary people enduring extraordinary burdens, finding ways to live, love, and persist within the rigid structures of feudal society. For medieval peasants, disease was an ever-present threat that shaped their lives, communities, and societies. Long before modern medicine, germ theory, or antibiotics, peasants lived in environments where sanitation was poor, nutrition inadequate, and medical knowledge limited. Outbreaks of sickness could sweep through villages with devastating speed, leaving behind death and despair. Most feared of all was the plague, especially the Black Death of the mid-14th century, which transformed European society forever. Yet plague was only one part of a wider landscape of illness. Leprosy, smallpox, dysentery, tuberculosis, ergot poisoning, and countless fevers afflicted peasants throughout their lives. Surviving such diseases required resilience, resourcefulness, and a reliance on folk remedies, communal solidarity, and faith. Despite limited understanding, peasants adapted strategies to endure these recurring threats, and in doing so, they shaped the trajectory of medieval society. The Black Death stands as the single most catastrophic outbreak in European history, and for peasants it was both a curse and, paradoxically, a turning point. Originating in Asia and traveling along trade routes, the plague reached Europe in 1347 and rapidly spread across the continent, carried by fleas on rats and facilitated by poor sanitation. Within a few years, it had killed an estimated 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe's population. For peasants, the horror was almost unimaginable. Entire villages were wiped out, families decimated, and survivors left traumatized. With no scientific understanding of bacteria or contagion, peasants attributed the plague to divine punishment, bad air, miasma, or malevolent forces. The helplessness they felt intensified their reliance on religion, penance, and rituals. Yet out of this devastation came social changes that ultimately altered the balance of power between peasants and their lords. The plague was not a single event, but a recurring phenomenon. Outbreaks returned periodically over the next 3 centuries, with local flare-ups killing thousands at a time. Peasants had to adapt to living with the constant fear of plague. Some fled villages, though most were bound by obligations and poverty that made mobility difficult. Others turned inward, avoiding strangers and travelers. Quarantines were sometimes imposed, though enforcement was uneven. In rural areas, isolation was a natural advantage, as small villages were less densely populated than cities, reducing the speed of transmission. Still, once the disease entered a community, it spread quickly among households that lived in cramped huts with little ventilation. For peasants, survival often came down to luck, chance, and the strength of their immune systems. But they nevertheless developed cultural and practical responses to recurring plagues. Beyond the plague, peasants faced a host of other diseases. Leprosy was one of the most feared, not because of its lethality, but because of the stigma attached to it. Those afflicted were often cast out of their communities, forced to live in leper houses on the margins of society. Tuberculosis, known as consumption, was widespread, slowly wasting away its victims. Dysentery, caused by contaminated water and poor sanitation, was a common killer, especially of children. Malaria lingered in marshy regions, while ergotism, or St. Anthony's fire, caused hallucinations, gangrene, and death when people ate rye contaminated with ergot fungus. Even childbirth was perilous for peasant women, with infections and complications killing many. Disease was not an occasional crisis but a constant background to medieval life, thinning the population in regular waves and shaping the rhythm of survival. Without modern medicine, peasants relied on a mixture of folk remedies, religious rituals, and communal practices to treat illness. Herbal medicine was central. Plants like garlic, onion, sage, and yarrow were believed to have healing properties. Cabbage was eaten for digestion. Honey was used as a salve for wounds, and willow bark, a natural source of salicylic acid, similar to aspirin, eased pain. Remedies were passed down orally, and local healers, often women, played a key role in tending the sick. Amulets and charms were also common, worn to ward off evil spirits, believed to cause disease. Treatments could be brutal. Bloodletting, purging, and cupping were widely practiced, based on the medieval medical theory of balancing the four humors. While often ineffective or harmful, these practices reflected the medical knowledge available at the time and provided a sense of agency for peasants facing otherwise uncontrollable diseases. Religion was another cornerstone of peasant responses to illness. The church taught that disease could be divine punishment for sin, and so confession, penance, and pilgrimages were seen as remedies for both body and soul. Saints were invoked for healing, with shrines and relics believed to have curative powers. During outbreaks of plague, processions and prayers were common, though ironically such gatherings often spread infection further. The flagellant movement, in which groups of penitents whipped themselves to atone for humanity's sins, gained popularity during the Black Death. For peasants, faith offered both explanations and hope, helping them endure suffering that otherwise seemed incomprehensible. Even when prayers failed to cure disease, they provided comfort and a sense of belonging to a larger spiritual struggle. Peasants also relied on community solidarity to survive. Villagers often cared for the sick collectively, with neighbors helping each other despite the risks. In times of plague, fear sometimes eroded this solidarity, leading to abandonment of the sick or scapegoating of minorities, such as Jews, who were falsely accused of spreading disease. Yet, in many cases, the bonds of kinship and necessity kept communities functioning. Peasants could not afford to completely isolate themselves. They needed one another to tend crops, gather food, and care for children. Survival depended on cooperation, and even in the face of terrifying outbreaks, the fabric of village life often endured. This resilience was remarkable, given the limited resources and knowledge peasants had at their disposal. The demographic impact of recurring disease outbreaks had profound consequences for peasants. The Black Death, in particular, drastically reduced the labor force, creating new opportunities for survivors. With fewer peasants available, lords could not demand as much labor, and peasants found themselves in a stronger bargaining position. In some regions, wages rose, and peasants gained more freedom to move or negotiate their obligations. This shift destabilized the rigid feudal system, contributing to peasant revolts and the slow decline of serfdom. In England, for example, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 was fueled in part by post-plague tensions, as lords attempted to reassert control over a peasantry that now recognized its increased leverage. Disease, while devastating, thus inadvertently empowered peasants and set the stage for long-term social change. Peasants' understanding of disease was shaped by both experience and imagination. With no concept of microbes, they explained illness through a mix of observation and superstition. Bad smells, or miasma, were thought to carry disease, leading peasants to avoid foul air and sometimes burn herbs to cleanse spaces. Astrology was another influence. Many believed the alignment of planets affected health, and medical texts often linked outbreaks to celestial events. Witchcraft was also invoked as an explanation, with accusations of sorcery sometimes directed at marginalized individuals. These beliefs were not mere ignorance, but attempts to make sense of an incomprehensible reality, offering explanations that fit within the cultural and intellectual framework of the time. Children were especially vulnerable to disease, and their survival was a constant worry for peasant families. Infant mortality rates were extremely high. Many children did not live past their first year. Diseases like measles, whooping cough, and dysentery swept through communities, leaving families grieving repeatedly. Mothers turned to both practical remedies and spiritual intercession, dedicating children to saints or placing protective charms in cradles. The fragility of child life shaped family structures, with parents often having many children in the hope that some would survive. For peasants, each surviving child represented both emotional continuity and practical labor needed to sustain the household. The psychological impact of living with constant disease cannot be overlooked. Fear, grief, and trauma were part of peasant life, especially during plague years, when corpses filled villages and entire families vanished. Yet peasants developed ways to cope. Laughter, storytelling, and communal gatherings provided outlets for stress. Festivals continued even in plague years, though sometimes with macabre overtones, such as the Dance of Death motif that became popular in medieval art. These cultural expressions reflected a society grappling with mortality, where death was a daily presence, but life still demanded to be lived. Peasants' ability to endure emotionally, as much as physically, was key to their survival. The legacy of peasants' survival strategies during times of disease was lost. Though they lacked modern knowledge, their reliance on herbal remedies, communal care, and religious practices helped sustain communities through repeated crises. More importantly, the demographic shifts caused by the plague and other diseases transformed European society, undermining feudal structures and gradually opening paths toward greater freedom for peasants. Disease was thus both a destructive force and a catalyst for change, reshaping the balance of power in medieval Europe. For the peasants who lived through it, survival was not guaranteed, but their endurance under such conditions remains a testament to human resilience. In conclusion, surviving plagues and diseases was perhaps the greatest challenge medieval peasants faced. With limited medical knowledge, inadequate sanitation, and constant exposure to pathogens, they endured suffering that modern societies would find unimaginable. Yet through faith, folk medicine, community support, and sheer resilience, they found ways to persist. The Black Death and other diseases devastated peasant populations, but they also reshaped medieval society, empowering survivors and altering the trajectory of European history. For peasants, survival was never simply a matter of health but of adapting culturally, socially, and spiritually to a world where disease was always at the door. Their endurance reveals not only the fragility of medieval life, but also the remarkable capacity of ordinary people to withstand extraordinary trials. Enduring famine and harsh agriculture for medieval peasants. Famine was not a rare catastrophe, but a recurring specter that haunted everyday existence. Unlike the sudden devastation of plague, famine crept slowly, beginning with poor harvests, worsened by bad weather or war, and culminating in widespread hunger. Agriculture was the foundation of medieval life, yet it was fraught with risk. Crops were vulnerable to pests, disease, and unpredictable climates, while storage techniques were primitive and yields consistently low. Peasants who lived at the edge of subsistence could not afford even a single bad harvest, for food shortages quickly translated into malnutrition, disease, and death. To endure famine required not only physical resilience, but also adaptive strategies, practices of rationing, foraging, communal support, and desperate improvisations. In many ways, the story of peasants and agriculture in the Middle Ages is one of precarious survival, where endurance meant working with the land's uncertainties while facing the constant possibility of hunger. Agriculture in medieval Europe was overwhelmingly subsistence-based. Most peasants farmed small strips of land within the open field system, where communal fields were divided into narrow strips assigned to individual households. Each family relied on the produce of their strips to sustain themselves, while also contributing labor to the lord's domain. This system limited flexibility. Peasants could not easily diversify or expand production beyond what was customary. The three-field rotation system, which gradually spread across Europe by the High Middle Ages, allowed for more efficient use of land, rotating between autumn-sown crops like wheat or rye, spring crops like oats or barley, and a fallow field left to recover. Even so, yields were meager by modern standards. On average, medieval grain yields produced only 2 to 4 times the amount of seed sown, compared to modern yields of 20 to 30 times. A few poor harvests could devastate a community already living at the edge of survival. Climate played a crucial role in agricultural success or failure, and peasants had no control over its fluctuations. The period between the 9th and 13th centuries, often called the medieval warm period, brought relatively favorable conditions, allowing population growth and agricultural expansion. But by the 14th century, the onset of the Little Ice Age brought cooler, wetter weather, shortening growing seasons and increasing the risk of crop failures. Heavy rains in 1315 to 1317, for example, led to the Great Famine in northern Europe, where continuous downpours rotted crops, drowned livestock, and ruined stored grain. Millions died of hunger, and those who survived were weakened and vulnerable to subsequent diseases. including the Black Death just decades later. For peasants, such climatic shifts meant that even the hardest labor could be undone by forces entirely beyond their control, deepening their sense of vulnerability before nature's unpredictability. The causes of famine were rarely purely natural. War, taxation, and social structures often exacerbated shortages. Armies marching through farmland destroyed crops, seized grain, and trampled fields. Lords and kings demanded rents, tithes, and taxes, even in years of scarcity, leaving peasants with little to feed their families. Grain merchants sometimes hoarded supplies, driving up prices and making food inaccessible to the poor. Thus, famine was as much a product of social inequality as of weather or harvest failure. Peasants bore the brunt of these crises, as they lacked the reserves, wealth, or mobility to protect themselves from shortages. Hunger, in turn, led to unrest, migration, and sometimes outright rebellion. As communities sought to resist the structures that intensified their suffering, the experience of famine was harrowing. As food supplies dwindled, peasants first tightened their belts, stretching grain stocks by mixing them with peas, beans, or even less nutritious fillers, like husks and weeds. Bread, usually the staple of the diet, became scarcer, and families resorted to pottage made with whatever vegetables, herbs, or scraps they could find. Meat, rare in good years, all but disappeared in famine, with peasants sometimes reduced to eating dogs, cats, or vermin. Foraging became a desperate necessity, with people consuming acorns, nettles, bark, or roots. Even when such food caused illness, chronic malnutrition weakened immune systems, making famine years especially deadly when combined with epidemics. Starving peasants often traveled in search of food, swelling the ranks of beggars on the roads and overwhelming towns that were themselves struggling with scarcity. The sight of emaciated families wandering the countryside was a grim reminder of the precariousness of medieval life. Despite these challenges, peasants developed strategies to cope with recurring hunger. Grain storage, though primitive, was crucial. Granaries and pits were used to preserve surplus, though rodents and moisture often spoiled reserves. Households supplemented their diet with garden plots, growing vegetables like onions, leeks, cabbages, and legumes, which added nutritional diversity and resilience in lean times. Livestock, particularly pigs and chickens, provided occasional meat and a steady source of eggs or dairy. Foraging skills were widely shared, with knowledge of edible plants, berries, and nuts passed down through generations. Communal sharing also played a role. Villagers often pooled resources to help struggling families, though this solidarity was strained in prolonged famines. These survival strategies did not eliminate hunger, but sometimes made the difference between life and death. Agricultural labor itself was grueling, and peasants endured physical hardship as part of their daily survival. Plowing required immense effort, especially in heavy clay soils. Harvesting grain was backbreaking, performed with sickles under the summer sun. Threshing, winnowing, and grinding grain consumed countless hours. Tools were simple and often homemade, limiting efficiency. Oxen or horses could ease the burden, but many peasants lacked the resources to keep draft animals, relying instead on sheer human effort. Women worked alongside men, not only in the fields but also in processing food, tending gardens, and caring for livestock. Children contributed from an early age, herding animals or gathering fuel. The sheer physical demands of peasant agriculture meant that hunger and exhaustion were constant companions, even in years of relative abundance. The relationship between peasants and lords further shaped how famine was experienced. Lords demanded their dues regardless of harvest success, extracting grain, livestock, or labor even in lean years. This system left peasants with little buffer against shortages, forcing them to absorb the brunt of scarcity, while lords maintained their own supplies. Some lords, however, provided relief, distributing grain from storehouses or easing rents temporarily to maintain the loyalty and survival of their tenants. The church also played a role, with monasteries sometimes acting as centers of charity, though they too demanded tithes that strained peasant resources. Ultimately, the rigid structures of feudalism left peasants highly vulnerable, as they bore the risks of agricultural failure, while others reaped the rewards of their labor. The psychological toll of famine was immense. Hunger gnawed not only at the body but also at the spirit, creating despair and hopelessness. Parents watched helplessly as children weakened, and choices between feeding one family member or another tore at the bonds of kinship. Communities sometimes fractured under the strain, with theft, violence, and accusations of hoarding increasing during times of scarcity. At the same time, famine often deepened religious faith, as peasants sought explanations and hope through prayer, penance, and rituals. Famines were interpreted as divine punishment for sin or as tests of faith, reinforcing the role of religion in shaping peasant responses to crisis. Even when the church failed to provide material relief, it offered a spiritual framework for enduring suffering. Despite these recurring disasters, peasants demonstrated remarkable resilience. Agricultural innovation, though slow, gradually improved food security. The spread of the three-field system, heavier plows, and water mills increased efficiency over the centuries. Crop diversification, with the introduction of beans and peas, provided more reliable sources of protein. Over time, population pressures, combined with recurring famines and plagues, forced adjustments in land use, tenancy, and labor obligations, leading to gradual shifts in the feudal system. These changes were uneven and slow, but they reflect how peasants, through sheer endurance, adapted to the structural limitations of medieval agriculture and the recurring threat of famine. The cultural memory of famine remains strong in medieval communities. Oral traditions, stories, and religious practices often carried echoes of past hunger, shaping attitudes toward food and survival. Festivals celebrating harvests were not only joyous but also deeply symbolic acknowledgments of the precariousness of abundance. Rituals surrounding sowing and reaping carried both practical and spiritual significance, reinforcing the belief that survival depended on both human labor and divine favor. In this way, famine was not merely a biological crisis but a cultural reality, woven into the very fabric of peasant life. In the long view, famine and agriculture were inseparable realities for medieval peasants. Their survival depended on the land, yet the land often failed them. They endured backbreaking labor, primitive technology, unpredictable climates, and exploitative social structures, all while living with the constant threat of hunger. Yet they survived, not only through physical endurance but through communal solidarity, cultural adaptation, and spiritual resilience. The story of famine in the Middle Ages is thus not only a story of suffering but also of survival. It reveals the vulnerability of human life when bound to the uncertainties of the natural world, but also the remarkable ability of ordinary people to endure, adapt, and persist despite the harshest of conditions. In conclusion, enduring famine and harsh agriculture was central to the lives of medieval peasants. Their world was one where hunger was never far away, where the fruits of labor were uncertain, and where survival required constant vigilance and resilience. They worked the land with primitive tools, harvested meager yields, and bore the burdens of lords and clergy. Yet they managed to keep themselves and their communities alive across centuries of hardship. Famine shaped not only their bodies but their cultures, their faith, and their social structures, leaving an indelible mark on medieval society. Their endurance stands as a testament to human resilience in the face of adversity, reminding us that behind the castles and cathedrals of medieval Europe were millions of ordinary peasants whose struggle for food and survival sustained the entire civilization. Resistance, resilience, and revolts. The story of medieval peasants is often told through the lens of hardship, hunger, plague, and oppression under lords. Yet survival was not a matter of passive endurance alone. Peasants resisted, adapted, and occasionally rose in revolt, asserting their dignity against the crushing weight of feudal demands. Their resilience was expressed not only in the extraordinary moments of rebellion, but also in the quiet persistence of daily life, finding joy in festivals, sustaining communities through solidarity, and subtly resisting exploitation through acts of defiance. The balance of power in medieval Europe was never entirely one-sided, for even the most downtrodden peasants possessed tools of negotiation, resistance, and collective strength. Over centuries, their endurance and struggles reshaped the social order, eroding the foundations of serfdom and laying the groundwork for new possibilities of freedom. To understand this dimension of peasant life, we must explore both the dramatic upheavals of revolt and the quieter forms of resilience that sustained them day by day. Everyday resilience. Survival as resistance. For most peasants, resistance was not expressed in open defiance, but in the small acts that enabled survival within oppressive systems. Working slowly, concealing portions of harvests, or claiming illness to avoid labor, were subtle strategies of defiance that undermined lordly control without provoking outright retaliation. Such everyday resistance gave peasants limited autonomy, allowing them to stretch resources and maintain a degree of independence in lives otherwise constrained by feudal obligations. In this sense, the very act of surviving, feeding families, preserving traditions, enduring famine and disease, was itself a form of resistance to a system designed to exploit their labor. Village solidarity played a central role in this resilience. Communities shared tools, labor, and knowledge, enabling them to withstand the burdens imposed by lords. The open field system, though restrictive, encouraged cooperation in plowing, sowing, and harvesting. Festivities, weddings, and religious observances reinforced bonds of kinship and mutual obligation. In times of crisis, such as famine or plague, neighbors often helped one another with food or care, even at great personal risk. This solidarity was not unbreakable. Scarcity could breed suspicion and division, but it provided the foundation for both survival and collective resistance. The resilience of the peasantry was thus deeply communal, rooted in networks of trust and reciprocity. Religion also provided resilience, even as it reinforced social hierarchies. The church demanded tithes and obedience, yet it also offered peasants a language of justice and hope. Biblical narratives of suffering, redemption, and divine justice resonated with peasants' experiences, inspiring both patience and protest. Saints, cults, pilgrimages, and feast days gave peasants spiritual resources to endure hardship, while also providing opportunities for communal joy. At the same time, religious ideas could be turned against authority. Preachers who emphasized equality before God or condemned the corruption of clergy and lords offered peasants a framework for questioning the legitimacy of their oppression. In this way, religion both sustained resilience and, at times, fueled revolt. Tensions within the feudal order. Peasant resistance cannot be understood without examining the contradictions of feudalism itself. The system depended on peasant labor to sustain lords, knights, and clergy, yet it continually strained that labor to the breaking point. Lords demanded rents, dues, and labor, while also reserving rights over forests, mills, and ovens. These impositions left peasants little room for economic security. At the same time, lords depended on peasants for their own wealth and status, creating a fragile balance of coercion and negotiation. Too much exploitation risked revolt, while too much leniency risked weakening lordly authority. Peasants understood this balance and used it to their advantage, pressing for concessions during times of crisis or scarcity. The demographic shifts following the Black Death heightened these tensions. With population drastically reduced, surviving peasants found themselves in greater demand. Labor shortages allowed them to demand higher wages or lighter obligations, and some sought better opportunities by leaving their lords' estates. Lords, desperate to maintain their traditional privileges, attempted to impose restrictions. In England, the Statute of Labourers of 1351 sought to cap wages and tie workers to their manors, sparking resentment. Across Europe, similar measures reflected elite fears of losing control over the peasantry. These efforts to reassert authority often backfired, provoking resistance that sometimes erupted into open revolt. Peasant revolts, explosions of resistance. The most dramatic expressions of peasant resistance came in the form of revolts. Though rare compared to everyday acts of endurance, revolts revealed the potential power of collective action and the deep grievances that simmered beneath the surface of medieval society. They were often triggered by crisis, famine, taxation, war, or attempts to restrict peasant freedoms, and they challenged not only local lords but sometimes the entire feudal order. One of the earliest major revolts was the Jacquerie in France in 1358, named after the derogatory term Jacques for peasants. Sparked by the devastation of the 100 Years' War and the heavy taxation that followed, peasants in northern France rose in fury against their lords. Armed with rudimentary weapons, they attacked manor houses, killing nobles and burning estates. Their rage reflected not only economic hardship, but also deep resentment at the aristocracy, as failure to protect them from war and banditry. The revolt was brutally suppressed, with thousands of peasants slaughtered, but it left a lasting scar on the French elite, a reminder that their dominance was not unassailable. In England, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 was a landmark moment of resistance. triggered by the imposition of a poll tax, which fell heavily on the poor. Peasants and townspeople alike rose in rebellion across southeastern England, led by figures like Wat Tyler and inspired by radical preachers such as John Ball. The rebels marched on London, demanding an end to serfdom, fair rents, and justice for common people. Their slogan, "When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman?" captured the spirit of equality and defiance. Though the revolt was eventually crushed and its leaders executed, it demonstrated the capacity of peasants to articulate political demands and challenge the social hierarchy. The memory of 1381 lingered, influencing later generations of workers and rebels. The German Peasants' War of 1524 to 1525, though occurring at the edge of the medieval period, represents the culmination of centuries of peasant resistance, spurred by economic hardship, heavy taxation, and inspired by Reformation ideas of spiritual freedom. Peasants across southern Germany rose in widespread rebellion. Their demands, articulated in the 12 Articles, called for the right to choose pastors, fair rents, and the abolition of certain feudal burdens. For a time, the revolt spread like wildfire, with thousands joining the cause, yet the rebellion was brutally crushed by princely armies, with tens of thousands killed. Still, the uprising revealed the deep fractures within feudal society and the potential for religious and social ideas to merge into a powerful critique of exploitation. The consequences of revolt. Most peasant revolts ended in bloodshed and repression, yet they were not without consequences. Lords and rulers, though often ruthless in quelling uprisings, could not entirely ignore the grievances that fueled them. In some cases, revolts accelerated reforms, such as the gradual decline of serfdom in England after the 14th century. Even where revolts failed, they demonstrated the capacity of peasants to organize, articulate demands, and resist oppression, leaving behind a cultural memory of defiance. For the ruling classes, revolts were both a warning and a justification for tightening control. For peasants, they were reminders of both the risks of rebellion and the possibility of asserting dignity against overwhelming odds. Cultural resilience. Joy amid hardship. Resistance was not only political, but also cultural. Peasants resisted despair by cultivating joy, humor, and festivity amid hardship. Festivals tied to the agricultural calendar, harvest feasts, May Day celebrations, Christmas revels, provided opportunities for relaxation and inversion of hierarchies. During Carnival, for example, peasants mocked authority through parody and satire, temporarily overturning the rigid order of daily life. These moments of joy were not trivial. They provided psychological relief and reinforced community bonds. Music, dance, and storytelling carried cultural memory and offered hope. By preserving traditions and asserting their humanity in the face of exploitation, peasants resisted the reduction of their lives to mere labor. Family and gender. In resilience, family structures were another key site of resilience. Households were economic as well as social units, pooling labor to meet the demands of survival. Women played vital roles, not only in domestic tasks, but also in fieldwork, animal care, and food production. Their contributions, often undervalued by both lords and chroniclers, were essential to community survival. Mothers preserved knowledge of herbs, remedies, and food preparation that sustained families through times of scarcity. Marriage alliances strengthened kinship ties, reinforcing networks of mutual support. Even in conditions of poverty, family bonds provided meaning and continuity, enabling peasants to endure hardships that might otherwise have been unbearable. The slow erosion of serfdom over centuries, the resilience and resistance of peasants contributed to the gradual erosion of feudalism. Economic shifts, demographic changes, and persistent bargaining by peasants led to the decline of serfdom in many parts of Europe. By the late Middle Ages, many peasants had transitioned from serfdom to tenancy, paying rent and money rather than labor. While inequality remained, this shift gave peasants greater autonomy and mobility. Revolts, though often crushed, signaled the impossibility of maintaining rigid feudal control in the face of changing realities. In this sense, peasant resilience was transformative, not only ensuring survival in the present, but reshaping the trajectory of European society. Memory and legacy. The legacy of peasant resistance endures in both historical memory and cultural imagination. Chronicles, written by nobles, often depicted revolts as dangerous uprisings of irrational mobs. but closer examination reveals the coherence of peasant demands and the courage of their actions. Oral traditions preserved memories of resistance, inspiring later struggles. The spirit of defiance expressed in the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 or the German Peasants' War resonates as part of a broader history of popular struggle against exploitation. Beyond revolts, the everyday resilience of peasants working, laughing, worshipping, and enduring remains a testament to the capacity of ordinary people to shape history, even under systems designed to silence them. Conclusion: endurance and defiance. The story of medieval peasants is not merely one of suffering but of survival, resilience, and resistance. They endured famine, plague, and exploitation, yet they resisted in both subtle and dramatic ways. Their daily acts of defiance, their communal solidarity, their religious hopes, and their cultural joys were all forms of resilience that allowed them to live with dignity. In moments of crisis, they rose in revolt, challenging the very foundations of feudalism and asserting their humanity against oppression. Though often suppressed, their struggles reshaped the balance of power, contributing to the slow decline of serfdom and the transformation of European society. To remember medieval peasants is to remember not only their hardships, but also their courage, the countless small acts of endurance, and the great, desperate uprisings that together formed a powerful legacy of resistance. Their story is a reminder that even the most marginalized and oppressed can, through resilience and solidarity, shape the course of history.